The knock at the bunker door. The bunker had been Ethan's world for 3 years. Concrete walls surrounded him, dull and unchanging. The hum of the air purifier was constant, the shelves stocked with canned food, and the faint glow of the old monitor his only connection to the outside. Ever since the invasion, he hadn't stepped outside. The surface world was a death trap. Alien patrols roamed, and the sky had turned a sickly red after the war. Humans were no longer at the top of the food chain. Ethan liked the silence. Silence meant safety. No movement, no sounds. It was a sign the world had forgotten him. That's how he had survived this long. So when the knock came, it wasn't just a sound. It was a shockwave through his carefully maintained isolation. Thud, thud, thud. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. The dull thud echoed through the thick metal of the bunker door. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. He set the spoon down quietly, his hand trembling. His heart began to pound in his chest. No one should know he was here. Another knock. Louder this time. Ethan rose from his chair, grabbing the shotgun that leaned against the wall. He moved toward the door, each step careful, deliberate. The bunker had no windows, but a small screen by the door displayed the feed from a camera outside. He flicked it on, his breath caught in his throat. Standing outside was a figure, slumped and shivering. At first glance, Ethan thought it was human. The slender build, the hands pressed against the door, everything seemed normal. But as he squinted at the screen, he noticed the differences. The figure's skin wasn't pale, but a faint shade of blue, glowing softly in the dim light. A tangled mess of silvery hair framed a face that wasn't quite human. Large, dark eyes stared directly into the camera. It was an alien, and it was begging to be let in. Ethan's first instinct was to ignore it. Aliens were the enemy. They were the reason the world had burned, the reason humanity had been hunted and scattered. But this one didn't look like the soldiers he'd seen on the monitor years ago. It wasn't armed, and its body language was desperate. It pounded weakly on the door again, then pressed its head against the cold metal, as if it could sense the safety inside. He hesitated. "It's a trick," he muttered to himself. "It's bait to get me to open the door." But something about the figure didn't fit. Its trembling hands, the faint glow of blood seeping from a wound on its side. It looked vulnerable. The alien sank to its knees, its lips moving as though it were speaking. Ethan turned up the volume on the monitor, but the words were garbled, a language he didn't recognize. Still, the tone was clear. It was pleading. Why would an alien be begging for help from a human? He whispered, gripping the shotgun tighter. His instincts screamed at him to leave it alone, to wait it out. But then, the alien lifted its head, and Ethan saw its eyes. They weren't the cold, calculating eyes of the soldiers he'd seen on the screens during the invasion. These were filled with fear and pain. It gasped, its voice barely audible through the speakers. "Help, please." Ethan's gut twisted. He hadn't seen another living soul in years. He told himself he didn't care, that the world was better left behind. But now, faced with this fragile, dying creature, something stirred in him. Against his better judgment, he reached for the console. "Don't do this," he muttered under his breath, punching in the code to unlock the outer door. The locks hissed and clicked, but he didn't open it all the way. Instead, he cracked it open just enough to see the figure outside. The cold air rushed in, along with a faint metallic smell of blood. The alien looked up at him, its eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Up close, Ethan could see the wounds on its body, deep gashes that glowed faintly, like liquid light leaking from its veins. Its breathing was shallow, each exhale ragged. "Why are you here?" Ethan demanded, keeping the shotgun pointed at the ground but ready to lift at a moment's notice. "What do you want?" The alien didn't answer. It tried to stand, but its legs buckled, and it collapsed onto the threshold. Its voice was barely above a whisper as it muttered something in its own language. Then, in broken English, it gasped, "They are coming. Ethan's blood ran cold. His eyes darted to the horizon visible through the crack in the door. The faint red glow of the sky seemed normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Who's coming?" he demanded, but the alien didn't respond. Its head lolled to the side as it fell unconscious. Ethan stared down at the crumpled figure, his mind racing. He could leave it there, let it die, and avoid the risk. But if it was telling the truth, if someone, or something, was coming, leaving the door open any longer was a bigger gamble. Cursing under his breath, he dragged the alien inside and slammed the door shut. The locks hissed and clicked back into place. He stared at the unconscious figure on the floor, blood pooling beneath it, and muttered to himself, "What the hell have I just done?" Outside, in the distant shadows, something moved. A dying plea. The bunker was no longer silent. The alien girl lay on the cold metal floor, her shallow breaths echoing in the confined space. Ethan stood over her, shotgun still in hand, his knuckles white from gripping it too hard. Every instinct screamed at him to kick her out, to shut the door and pretend none of this ever happened. Instead, he stared, his mind racing. What if she was dangerous? What if she was a spy sent to lure him into a trap? He didn't trust her, but something kept him rooted in place. The faint glow of her wounds pulsed like a dying ember, casting soft light across her trembling frame. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't like the invaders he'd seen on the news years ago. Those aliens had marched in shiny armor, their faces cold and calculated. This girl, in contrast, looked fragile, like she was barely holding on to life. He finally knelt beside her, setting the shotgun down, but within arm's reach. Up close, the alien's injuries were worse than he thought. Long gashes ran across her arms and sides, oozing that strange glowing fluid. Her breathing was uneven, and her silvery skin was damp with sweat. Ethan felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. "What the hell am I doing?" he muttered under his breath. "I don't even know if you understand me." The girl's lips moved, but the words were garbled. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she looked up at him. Weakly, she raised a hand, her fingers clutching at something around her neck. Ethan leaned in closer, noticing for the first time a strange metallic device hanging on a chain. It looked like a cross between a pendant and a piece of alien tech. Her hand trembled as she tried to remove it, but she didn't have the strength. "What is that?" Ethan asked, though he knew she couldn't answer. He reached out cautiously, his fingers brushing against the device. It was warm, warmer than he expected, and vibrated faintly, like it was alive. The moment he touched it, the girl's eyes widened, and she gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They will come." The words sent a chill down his spine. He pulled his hand back, watching as the girl collapsed again, her grip loosening. He didn't understand what she meant, but the urgency in her voice was enough to set him on edge. Was this device some kind of tracker? Had it led her pursuers straight to his bunker? Ethan jumped to his feet and hurried to the surveillance console. The screen flickered as he cycled through the cameras outside. The barren wasteland looked as desolate as ever, the horizon bathed in the eerie red glow of the sky. But then he saw it. Movement, a shadow darting between the rocks in the distance. His stomach dropped. "Damn it," he hissed. He hadn't survived this long by being reckless, and now he'd let a dying alien into his safe haven, practically inviting trouble to his doorstep. He grabbed the shotgun and paced back to the girl. She hadn't moved, her breathing even fainter now. Ethan's mind raced. He could still throw her out, lock the door, and hope whoever, or whatever, was out there moved on. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he stared down at her, he remembered the look in her eyes when she'd begged him for help. She hadn't looked like a soldier or a predator. She'd looked scared. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "You're going to get me killed," he muttered, grabbing the medical kit from the shelf. He didn't know if human medicine would work on her, But he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Carefully, he cleaned one of the glowing wounds on her arm. The glowing blood hissed and bubbled when it touched the antiseptic, and he winced, hoping he wasn't making things worse. The girl stirred slightly, her lips moving again. Ethan leaned closer, trying to make out what she was saying. Her voice was barely a whisper, but he caught fragments of words. They hunt. Core. Core? What core? Ethan's eyes darted to the strange device around her neck. Was that what they were after? Was this thing so important that it was worth her life? The screen at the surveillance console suddenly flickered, drawing his attention. A new shape appeared on the horizon. A hulking figure, tall and armored, moving with purpose. It wasn't alone. Smaller figures flanked it, their movements swift and predatory. Ethan's heart sank. They weren't just coming. They were here. He turned back to the girl, who had fallen unconscious again. "What the hell have you gotten me into?" he muttered, gripping his shotgun and preparing for the fight of his life. Hunted. Ethan's bunker wasn't quiet anymore. The alarms he had set for years of safety blared in sharp mechanical shrieks. Red lights pulsed along the walls, casting jagged shadows across the cold metal room. The air inside felt heavier now, like it was thick with the weight of the danger outside. He peered at the monitor again. 3 figures moved in the distance, just beyond the jagged rocks of the wasteland. Even at a glance, it was obvious they weren't human. Their movements were too fluid, too precise, as if the desert terrain didn't slow them down. One of them, a towering figure covered in alien armor, lifted its head. The glowing slit of its helmet scanned the ground, as if it could smell its prey. "They've tracked you here," Ethan muttered, glancing back at the unconscious alien girl. Her breathing was shallow, her silvery skin glistening with sweat as the wounds on her side glowed faintly. The pendant around her neck, a strange device she had called a core, still vibrated faintly. It was like a beacon, screaming out their location to whoever, or whatever, was hunting her. Ethan slammed his fist against the wall, cursing under his breath. He had spent years avoiding trouble, staying hidden while the rest of the world burned. Now, in the span of hours, his sanctuary had become a death trap. "You just couldn't die out there, could you?" he muttered, grabbing his shotgun. "No, you had to bring them right to me." The monitor flickered again. One of the hunters broke off from the group, darting ahead with alarming speed. Ethan tightened his grip on the shotgun. His traps were still active. The motion sensors, the pressure mines, the automated turret he had salvaged from an old military bunker. But if these hunters were anything like the invaders from the war, they wouldn't be easy to stop. He moved to the center of the room, where the girl lay. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she looked up at him with a mix of fear and pain. "Run," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't fight them." Ethan snorted. "Not much of a runner," he said, nodding at his leg brace, a crude metal contraption he built to support the knee he had shattered during the invasion. "Besides, this is my home. I don't believe." The girl struggled to sit up, but her body gave out, and she slumped back to the floor. "They will kill you," she gasped. "Take the core and kill you." "Yeah, well, I'm not big on dying, so we'll see about that," Ethan said, grabbing the remote control for the traps. He tapped a button, and the screen showed the motion sensors activating outside. The hunters were moving closer now, their outlines sharper against the red horizon. Ethan's jaw tightened. One of the smaller hunters stepped onto a mine. The explosion shook the ground, a deafening roar that rattled the bunker walls. For a moment, Ethan felt a flicker of satisfaction, until the dust cleared, and the other 2 hunters emerged from the smoke, completely unscathed. The armored one raised an arm, and a pulse of blue energy shot out, blasting away the remaining mines. Ethan swore under his breath. "Figures," he muttered. "Nothing's ever easy." The girl coughed weakly, her glowing blood pooling on the floor. She looked up at him again, her dark eyes filled with desperation. "The core," she whispered. "It's the only thing they want." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. He could throw the core outside, let the hunters take it, and hope they'd leave. But something about the way she clung to it, even in her weakened state, made him hesitate. She had risked her life for this thing, carried it across a wasteland with those monsters chasing her. Whatever the core was, it wasn't just some trinket. "You're not telling me everything, are you?" he said, kneeling beside her. "Why is this thing so important?" The girl's eyes flickered shut again, and she muttered something in her own language, the words too faint to understand. Ethan cursed and stood, slinging the shotgun over his shoulder. He didn't have time for answers. The hunters were almost at the bunker's door. The first impact came like a thunderclap. The bunker shook as something heavy slammed against the metal door, leaving a deep dent. Ethan's heart pounded as he checked the monitor. The armored hunter was standing at the entrance, its massive frame almost filling the screen. It raised one clawed hand, and another impact followed, louder and harder than the first. "Here we go," Ethan muttered, flipping the safety off his shotgun. "You wanted help, kid. Let's see if I can keep us alive long enough to regret it." The third blow cracked the metal, and a faint hiss of air escaped from the bunker. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Ethan positioned himself behind the makeshift barricades he had built years ago, aiming at the door. His traps wouldn't stop them, but maybe they'd slow them down enough for him to make a stand. As the final blow sent the door crashing open, Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. The first hunter stepped inside, its glowing eyes locking onto him. Behind it, the armored figure loomed like a shadow of death. Ethan smirked, his heartbeat steady despite the odds. Welcome to the party. The crystal's secret. The bunker was dark now, the lights flickering weakly as the power system struggled to recover. Ethan leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, his shotgun lying on the floor beside him. Blood dripped from a shallow cut on his temple, and his muscles ached from the fight. But the alien girl, Myra, was alive. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. She sat across from him, clutching the strange glowing crystal, the core, as if it were the last thing tethering her to life. Its faint, rhythmic pulse bathed her in a soft light, illuminating the silvery streaks of her sweat-dampened skin. Ethan had questions, too many to count, but the silence between them felt like a fragile thread, and he wasn't ready to break it just yet. Finally, Myra looked up, her dark, shimmering eyes meeting his. She was still pale, her breathing shallow, but there was a fierce determination in her expression now. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice hoarse but steady. Her English was broken but clear enough to understand. "You saved me." Ethan snorted, wiping the blood off his brow with the back of his hand. "Yeah, well, don't thank me yet. Pretty sure those things will come back. Maybe not today, but they will. And next time, I might not have enough ammo." Myra winced and clutched the core tighter. The glowing light flickered for a moment, and Ethan noticed how her shoulders tensed, as if she was afraid it might go out. "That thing," he said, nodding toward the crystal. "What is it? Why is it so damn important?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the floor. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, she held the core out in front of her, cradling it in her hands like a fragile piece of glass. "This," she began, her voice trembling, "is life. For my people." Ethan frowned, leaning forward. "Life? What does that even mean?" Myra struggled for the right words, her brow furrowed in concentration. "My world. Dying. Long time. Core is last hope. Energy. For our planet. To heal." Ethan's stomach sank as her words sank in. He wasn't sure he believed her. Not entirely. But the desperation in her voice was hard to ignore. She wasn't just running for her life. She was running for the survival of her entire species. "That's why they're after you," he said slowly. "Those hunters. They want it." Myra nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the core. If they take it, use it, many worlds die. Not just mine. Ethan rubbed his face, trying to process what she was saying. He'd lived through the invasion, seen the destruction the aliens had caused, but this was something bigger than anything he'd imagined. He had thought the war was over, that humanity had lost. But now, it seemed like the fight was still going on, just on a scale far beyond Earth. "Why come here?" he asked finally. "Why Earth? We're barely holding on as it is." Myra hesitated again, her gaze darting away. Ethan caught the flicker of guilt in her expression before she answered. "Earth was strong. Before. Your people, smart, made things like this." She gestured to the core, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying humans built that thing?" She nodded. "Long ago. You forgot. But we remember." Ethan stared at the crystal, his mind racing. He didn't know what was more unsettling, the idea that humanity had once created something so powerful, or the fact that they had forgotten about it entirely. It was like discovering a loaded gun buried in the sand, not knowing who had put it there or why. "And you think there's somewhere here you can use it?" he asked. "Yes," she said firmly, though her voice still wavered with exhaustion. "A place from before. A lab. My people heard stories. If core, activated there, can work." Ethan leaned back against the wall, letting out a long breath. He didn't know what to think. Part of him wanted to believe her, to help her. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive all these years, was screaming that this was a mistake. Helping her had already brought the hunters to his doorstep. If he went any further, he'd be risking everything. But then he looked at her again. She was fragile, yes, but there was something unbreakable in her eyes. A determination that reminded him of the people he had lost. Friends, family, everyone who had fought and died when the aliens invaded. He couldn't save them. But maybe, just maybe, he could save her. Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he said finally. "We'll find this lab of yours. But you'd better pray it's still there, and that thing of yours actually works." Myra's eyes widened, and for the first time since she had stumbled into his bunker, she smiled. It was faint and fleeting, but it was enough to make Ethan's chest tighten. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered, pushing himself to his feet. "If we're doing this, we need to move fast. Pack your things, whatever you've got left. We leave at first light." Outside, the wasteland stretched on, endless and unforgiving. And somewhere out there, the hunters were waiting. A dangerous journey. The wasteland stretched endlessly before them, a barren expanse of red sand and jagged rocks under a sky that burned like fire. Ethan pulled his hood tighter around his face, squinting against the stinging wind. Beside him, Myra moved with a slow but determined gait, the core clutched tightly against her chest. Its faint glow pulsed with every step, a beacon of hope or disaster, depending on who found them first. Ethan's nerves were on edge. It had been years since he had ventured beyond the safety of his bunker, and the world outside was worse than he remembered. The air tasted of ash, and the silence was unsettling. No birds, no insects, just the occasional distant howl of wind through the rocky outcroppings. "How far is this place?" he asked, his voice muffled by his scarf. Myra glanced at him, her silvery hair shimmering in the dim light. "Far," she said simply. Her breathing was labored, and he could see the strain in her steps. The wounds on her body, though bandaged, hadn't fully healed. But there was no time to rest. They both knew that. Ethan tightened his grip on the makeshift rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. "Far isn't a great answer," he muttered. "You sure you even know where we're going?" Myra hesitated, her gaze dropping to the core in her hands. "Stories. Maps," she said quietly. "My people, they told of the lab. Hidden. Old human place." But she trailed off, and Ethan caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "But you're not sure it's still there," he finished for her. He sighed, shaking his head. "Figures. I'm risking my neck for a maybe." Myra stopped walking, her dark eyes locking onto his. "Not maybe," she said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised him. "If lab is gone, we find another way. But core must live." Ethan didn't respond. He wanted to argue, to tell her how reckless this was, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. There was something in her determination that made him pause. She wasn't just running for herself. She was running for an entire world. That kind of desperation wasn't something you could fake. Still, the doubt gnawed at him. How much longer could they keep this up? The hunters hadn't shown themselves since the attack on the bunker, but Ethan knew better than to think they'd given up. They were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed in the distance. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. Myra stiffened beside him, her fingers tightening around the core. "What was that?" Ethan whispered, his eyes scanning the horizon. Myra didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a ridge up ahead, her expression tense. "There," she said. "We hide." Ethan didn't need convincing. The two of them scrambled toward the ridge, keeping low as the rumble grew louder. By the time they reached the rocky outcrop, the sound had become a deafening roar, like thunder rolling across the desert. Ethan pressed his back against the cool stone, his rifle at the ready. Myra crouched beside him, her breaths shallow and quick. The source of the noise came into view moments later. A massive alien craft, sleek and predatory, gliding low over the desert floor. Its surface shimmered like liquid metal, and the faint hum of its engines sent vibrations through the ground. Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched it pass overhead, its searchlights sweeping the landscape. "They're still hunting us," he said grimly. "How long before they find us?" Myra shook her head. "Not yet. Core hides us. For now." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The core hides us? You could have mentioned that earlier." She gave him a faint smile, her expression weary. "Not forever. They will find us, if we stay." The craft circled once, then disappeared over the horizon. Ethan let out a slow breath, his grip on the rifle loosening slightly. "We can't keep running like this," he said. "If that lab of yours isn't where you think it is." "It is," Myra interrupted. Her voice was soft but resolute. "I feel it. Close." Ethan wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't just guessing. She truly believed in what she was saying. And as much as he hated to admit it, he didn't have a better plan. "Fine," he said, pushing himself to his feet. "But if you're wrong, we're out of options." They set off again, the ridge fading behind them as they moved deeper into the wasteland. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sand. With every step, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hunters hadn't found them yet, but it was only a matter of time. Hours later, as the sky turned a deep crimson, Myra suddenly stopped. She pointed ahead, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "There," she said, her voice trembling. "The lab." Ethan followed her gaze and felt his stomach twist. In the distance, half buried in the sand, was the crumbling shell of an old human facility. Its walls were cracked and weathered, but the faint glow of lights inside suggested it was still operational. "Let's hope this isn't a wild goose chase," Ethan muttered, tightening his grip on his rifle. "Because if it is, we're out of places to run." They moved toward the lab, unaware that in the distance, the hunters were closing in. The final stand. The lab's doors groaned as they slid open, their rusted metal scraping against the floor. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old machinery and dust, a reminder of a time when humans had built wonders and forgotten them. Ethan stepped through cautiously, his rifle raised, scanning the dark, cavernous space. Myra followed behind him, clutching the core close to her chest. Its faint glow lit the path ahead, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The lab felt alive, but not in a comforting way. Faint hums and clicks echoed from unseen machines, and wires hung like vines from the ceiling. Monitors flickered weakly, displaying long-forgotten schematics in languages Ethan didn't understand. Myra's eyes darted around the room, her expression a mixture of awe and desperation. "This is it?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "This is where we're supposed to save the universe." Myra ignored the sarcasm. She stepped forward, her trembling hands brushing against a dusty control panel. "It works," she whispered, her tone filled with fragile hope. "Not dead. Core can. Link." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Link? You mean activated here?" He glanced over his shoulder toward the lab entrance. "You'd better hurry. We don't have time for a tour." As if on cue, a faint vibration ran through the floor. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but Ethan felt it in his bones. Something heavy was moving outside. "They're here," he said grimly. "The hunters. They've found us." Myra's breathing quickened, but she didn't stop. She ran her fingers across the console, her glowing skin casting faint patterns over the ancient controls. With a soft click, the core in her hands began to glow brighter, its pulse quickening. Ethan watched as symbols on the monitor shifted, rearranging themselves into something coherent. Whatever she was doing, it was working. But time wasn't on their side. Ethan moved toward the entrance, peering out into the dark wasteland beyond. In the distance, he saw them. 3 figures, their silhouettes sharp and menacing against the red horizon. The hunters were closing in, their armored bodies reflecting the faint light of the setting sun. The leader, taller and more heavily armed than the others, carried a massive weapon that glowed ominously at the barrel. "Great," Ethan muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. "They brought toys." He turned back to Myra. "How long is this going to take?" "Not long," she said, her voice strained. Sweat dripped from her brow as she worked, her fingers flying across the console. "But you must. Stop them. Stop them." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "There's 3 of them, and 1 of me. You're asking for a miracle." Myra turned to him, her dark eyes fierce despite her exhaustion. "Not miracle. Just hold. Few minutes." Ethan sighed, muttering under his breath. "Few minutes. Sure. No problem." He grabbed a small pack from his belt, pulling out the last of his makeshift grenades and tripwires. If this was going to be his last stand, he wasn't going down without a fight. The vibration in the floor grew stronger, and soon, the first hunter stepped into view. Its glowing eyes scanned the lab, locking onto Ethan immediately. Behind it, the other 2 flanked the leader, their movements precise and coordinated. Ethan smirked, adrenaline surging through him. "All right, you ugly bastards. Let's dance." The first hunter lunged, moving faster than Ethan expected. He rolled to the side, firing a shot from his rifle. The bullet ricocheted off the creature's armor, but it staggered slightly, giving him just enough time to toss a grenade. The explosion shook the room, filling the air with smoke and debris. The second hunter charged through the smoke, swinging a blade-like arm toward him. Ethan barely dodged, his heart pounding as he fired again. This time, the shot hit a weak point in the armor, and the creature let out a guttural roar before collapsing. The leader stepped forward now, its massive weapon humming with energy. Ethan knew he didn't stand a chance against it, not head-on. He retreated toward the console where Myra was working, hoping the traps he'd set would slow it down. Behind him, Myra cried out. The core was glowing brighter than ever, its light almost blinding. Symbols on the monitors flashed rapidly, and the hum of the ancient machinery grew louder. Ethan glanced back at her, his chest tightening. She was pale, her body trembling as if the core was draining her energy. "Myra," he shouted. "What's happening?" "It's working," she gasped. "But need more time." The leader fired its weapon, and a beam of blue energy tore through the lab, narrowly missing Ethan. He dove behind a piece of broken machinery, his ears ringing from the blast. The heat of the shot scorched the air, and the smell of burning metal filled his lungs. "More time," he muttered, shaking his head. "You've got about 30 seconds before we're both fried." The leader advanced, its glowing eyes fixed on Mara now. Ethan's stomach dropped. It didn't care about him. It was after the core. And if it reached her, it was all over. With a roar, Ethan leaped from his cover, firing his rifle at the leader's head. The bullets pinged harmlessly off its armor, but it turned toward him, momentarily distracted. "Yeah, that's right," Ethan growled, backing toward the console. "Come and get me, you overgrown tin can." The hunter raised its weapon again, but before it could fire, a deafening surge of energy erupted from the core. The entire lab was bathed in blinding white light, and the sound of machinery reached a fever pitch. Ethan turned to see Myra collapsing to the floor, the core now floating above the console, pulsing with raw, unimaginable power. The hunters froze, their movements jerky and disoriented, as if the energy had disrupted their systems. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Myra and dragged her behind cover just as the core unleashed a second wave of energy, shaking the entire lab to its foundations. Outside, the horizon burned brighter than ever, and for the first time, Ethan realized that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Hope reborn. The world had gone silent. Ethan blinked, his vision swimming with afterimages from the blinding surge of energy that had erupted from the core. His ears rang, drowning out the crackle of the shattered monitors and the groan of the crumbling lab walls. For a moment, he thought he might be dead, but then the searing pain in his shoulder reminded him otherwise. Death didn't hurt this much. Beside him, Myra lay motionless, her silvery skin pale and almost translucent. The core hovered above the console, spinning slowly now, its once pulsing glow steady and radiant. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, crackling with power. Ethan didn't need to understand alien technology to know that it wasn't done yet. Whatever Myra had activated was still building towards something massive. He pushed himself up, biting back a groan, and looked around the lab. The walls were scorched, the floor cracked, and debris littered every corner. The hunters were gone, at least, the ones who had made it into the lab. Their remains were scattered across the room, their metallic bodies twisted and melted by the core's unleashed energy. But the fight wasn't over. Through the jagged opening where the lab's doors had once stood, Ethan saw it. The hunter's ship. It hovered ominously just beyond the ridge, its sleek, predatory form gleaming under the blood-red sky. The sound of its engines was low and menacing, like the growl of a beast ready to pounce. From its underbelly, smaller craft began to descend, their shapes unmistakably designed for combat. "Of course," Ethan muttered, wiping blood from his face. "They're not giving up that easy." He turned back to Myra, kneeling beside her and shaking her gently. "Hey, wake up," he said, his voice urgent. "Whatever you did, it worked. But we're not out of this yet." Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him weakly. "Core, alive," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But I can't." "You don't have to do anything else," Ethan interrupted, glancing at the advancing ships. "Just stay with me, all right? I'll handle the rest." Myra's gaze flicked to the core, her expression filled with equal parts awe and fear. "It will save," she whispered. "But only if they don't. Take it." Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. He knew what she was saying. If the hunters got their hands on the core, everything they had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, would be for nothing. He had to protect it, no matter the cost. "All right," he said, standing and grabbing his rifle. "You stay here. Keep breathing. That's your job. I'll take care of the rest." He moved to the entrance of the lab, stepping over the wreckage of the earlier battle. The smaller craft were landing now, their sleek doors hissing open to reveal more hunters, taller, stronger, and more heavily armed than the ones before. Ethan's heart pounded as he counted at least a dozen of them, each moving with a terrifying precision, that sent a chill down his spine. He checked his rifle. 2 bullets left. Not exactly ideal. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't fight them head-on. Not like this. But he didn't have to win. He just had to buy time. The Corps was doing something big, and if he could keep the hunters from interfering long enough, maybe they'd all get out of this alive. "All right, you ugly bastards," he muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. "Let's see how much fight you've got left." The first hunter stepped through the broken doors, its glowing eyes scanning the room. Ethan fired his first shot, aiming for its exposed neck joint. The bullet hit its mark, and the hunter crumpled to the ground with a metallic groan. The others hesitated for a moment, then advanced as one, their weapons raised. Ethan ducked behind a fallen piece of machinery as a barrage of energy blasts tore through the lab. The air crackled with heat, and sparks flew as the walls and consoles were shredded by the onslaught. He fired his second shot blindly, hearing it ricochet off armor, but not finding its target. "Out of ammo," he muttered, tossing the rifle aside. Figures. The hunters pressed forward, their movements relentless. Ethan scrambled toward the Corps, which was now spinning faster, its glow intensifying. The air around it was thick with energy, making his skin tingle. He had no idea what it was about to do, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let the hunters reach it. With a roar, Ethan grabbed a length of pipe from the floor and charged at the nearest hunter. The improvised weapon wouldn't do much against their armor, but it was all he had. He swung with all his strength, the impact jarring his arms as the hunter staggered back. Another one lunged at him, its blade-like arm slicing through the air. Ethan barely dodged, the blade grazing his shoulder and sending a burst of pain through his body. He fell to the ground, gasping for breath as the hunters closed in. This was it. He was out of time, out of options. And then the Corps erupted. A shockwave of pure energy burst from its center, blasting outward in a blinding wave of light. The hunters froze, their bodies jerking as the energy ripped through their systems. One by one, they collapsed, their glowing eyes flickering out like dying embers. Ethan shielded his face, the heat of the wave searing his skin. When the light finally faded, the lad was silent once more. He turned to see Myra standing, her frail body illuminated by the Corps' light. She looked stronger now, her wounds already healing as the energy flowed through her. The Corps hovered between them, its glow steady and calming. "It's done," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan collapsed to his knees, a weak laugh escaping his lips. "You better hope it is," he said, looking up at her with a tired smile, "because I'm not doing that again." Outside, the red sky began to shift, its ominous glow fading into a soft, golden hue. For the first time in years, the horizon looked alive. Hope had been reborn.